For the past 20 to 30 years, questions about the role of biological diversity have driven scientific research in new directions. To better understand diversity's significance, ecologists now use a combination of field experiments and theoretical models. They scrutinize the mechanisms involved in the maintenance of diversity, as well as the spread of disease and the nature of intricate species interactions. And they find that hypotheses in ecology, like in any other area of biological science, are testable and the results are instructive. At the Cedar Creek Natural History Area in Minnesota, David Tillman devises a set of controlled experiments to test how biological diversity influences ecosystem function.
We have been studying dynamics of plants and insects in hundreds of plots at Cedar Creek Natural History Area since 1982. And one of our major techniques is just to annually record the abundance of every species in each one of these plots, and then look at what happens through time. And it was actually doing this that we came upon our discovery of the relationship between diversity and stability.
In the late 1980s, he turned a bit of bad luck into an opportunity to learn something. Severe drought ravaged this prairie, but some plots at Cedar Creek bounced right back, prompting Tillman to ask why and how. This was a rare opportunity to test the long-held idea that more diverse systems are more stable, and to reveal some secrets of ecosystem function.
It was the third worst drought in the 150 years of recorded meteorology for Minnesota, a very severe drought. During that drought, we saw that some of these communities, which happened to contain a large number of plant species, were harmed by it. They had their biomass fall to about half of what it had been beforehand. But other ones had their biomass fall down to a tenth or a twelfth of what it had been. There's a 6 or so fold difference in how they were impacted by drought. And the single best variable at explaining it was the number of species. The more species there were in these plots, the more resistant they were to this major disturbance, the more stable they were.
Thus, Tillman began exploring questions of diversity within ecosystems, taking extensive measurements in the field and applying mathematics and statistical theory.
Mathematics is becoming a very important part of the discipline of ecology. Ecology is a science that has a strong experimental component, a strong observational component, but also an increasingly strong component for mathematical theory, trying to integrate the ideas that we observe in nature and try to understand their implications. And so about half of what I do as a scientist is actually developing mathematical theory, mathematical explanations for the kinds of things we observe, for what controls how ecosystems function, the role of what species are in them, the diversity of the ecosystems, the disturbances they might experience, and so on.
Through this work, Tillman has found that models from economic theory can provide a framework for understanding and characterizing the interrelationships involved in ecosystem function.
The portfolio effect is a phrase that we use to describe why it is that more diverse systems are more stable. And there are a lot of analogies between the human economy and how ecosystems work. Many people know that if you invest in a more broadly diversified portfolio of stock, that it varies less from year to year in its value than if you just choose one or two kinds of stock. And that comes about because you're averaging things which are tending to vary somewhat at random. And when you average more and more things together, it tends to vary less. And because nature always has good and bad years for different species, if you have many species growing together and average their responses, that average of that more diverse portfolio in nature is more stable. It doesn't vary as much. So that's one reason why diversity can affect stability.
Tillman reached this conclusion through meticulous observation and measurement of plant species at Cedar Creek over a period of many years. Each summer, the natural area is his lab.
We did this work in 4 different fields, about 50 plots per field. The plots themselves are 4 by 4 meters in size. To sample the plots, every year we clip a strip of vegetation that is 10 centimeters wide by 3 meters long. So it's a long, narrow strip of vegetation. And the advantage of sampling in that way is that a long, narrow strip will average over the patchiness that you see within a plot. And that allows us to get a quantitative measure of abundances of species.
Tillman and his team crunched the numbers to figure out how the different species interact and how these interactions might keep the ecosystem stable.
It takes about 12 to 15 people helping me do this, about 2 weeks of our time in a summer, to clip and then sort all this vegetation and species. You pick them up, look at them, identify them, then you have to dry them to get rid of the water that's in them and weigh them. Then you have to enter the data in computers and everything else and analyze it, look at what's happening, and do this year after year after year in several hundred plots.
Tillman's team tests the hypothesis that a more diverse ecosystem is more productive and more stable. Within a designated area, ecologists compare one plot of very few species with another that is more diverse. While all plant species depend on water, nutrients, and the microorganisms that cycle the nutrients in the soil, different species use different kinds and amounts. When an ecosystem experiences a disturbance such as insect blight, fire, or drought, researchers have new opportunities to observe that system's response. Disturbances that remove or reduce the abundance of species from the ecosystem affect nutrient uptake patterns. But when recovery begins, species in the more diverse ecosystem are likely to fill niches left empty by lost species, thus stabilizing the system.
What we saw happening was when one was harmed by a drought, other ones increased. They sort of increased using the resources left unconsumed by the species that was harmed by the drought. Differences among species means that they compensate for each other, that one takes the place of the other one. And if you have this kind of diversity in an ecosystem, it means that when that ecosystem is disturbed, this diversity is almost an insurance policy. Because when one does poorly, the nitrogen or the water that it doesn't take up, something else can take up and grow with. And that kind of compensation basically ensures that the functioning of that system will not be harmed as much as it would have been from a disturbance if there had been fewer species in the system. Is the scientific take-home lesson. That is that we now have discovered the trade-offs among species, the differences among species which allow species to coexist, and we've discovered that those same differences that have allowed 2 or 3 different million species to evolve and coexist on Earth, those same forces also mean that the number of species in an ecosystem influences how it functions, and that systems that are more diverse are more stable, they're more efficient providers of services that humans need from natural ecosystems.
As an ecosystem ecologist, Tillman measures the productivity of diverse plots to better understand stability. But other researchers scrutinize species interactions, seeking a greater understanding of community ecology. In some cases, scientists studying community relationships can uncover clear connections between biological diversity and an increased risk for humans of exposure to disease. At the Institute of Ecosystem Studies in Millbrook, New York, Rick Ostfeld assesses biological diversity among species in patchy forest environments. He hopes to understand how changes in diversity led to the emergence of Lyme disease in humans in the 1980s.